The Andromeda spiral had been at war for precisely 437 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting, of course, except for the obsessively meticulous record keepers of both warring factions who documented every skirmish, diplomatic slight, and strongly worded communique, with the dedication of accountants auditing the universe's most boring spreadsheet. On one side of this cosmic chess match sat the Vorthak Empire, a collection of 8-foot-tall crystalline beings who had turned warfare into something resembling a doctoral thesis defense. Their ships gleamed with mathematical precision. Their battle formations followed geometric principles that would make Euclid weep with joy, and their strategic planning sessions could last longer than some civilizations' entire lifespans. They approached conflict with the methodical patience of a librarian organizing infinity, which was both their greatest strength and their most spectacular weakness. Opposing them floated the Etherean Coalition, creatures of pure energy who had evolved beyond physical form sometime around the era when Earth was still figuring out how to make fire without burning down the neighborhood. They conducted warfare like a ballet choreographed by quantum physicists, all flowing movements and elegant probability cascades. Their battle strategies resembled abstract art installations that happened to involve antimatter torpedoes and gravitational wave manipulators. Beautiful, certainly, but about as practical as using a Stradivarius to hammer nails. The war had reached that peculiar state of equilibrium that military historians would later describe as cosmically awkward. Both sides possessed weapons capable of unraveling space-time itself, which meant neither dared use them for fear of accidentally erasing the very fabric of reality and having to explain that embarrassing oversight to their respective insurance companies. Instead, they had settled into a routine of elaborate posturing, technological one-upmanship, and the kind of passive-aggressive diplomacy that made family holiday dinners look like models of healthy communication. The Vorthak would spend months calculating the optimal trajectory for a single photon torpedo, factoring in solar wind patterns, gravitational anomalies, and the theoretical mood swings of nearby quasars. The Ethereans would counter by shifting their fleet formations into aesthetically pleasing configurations that happened to render the Vorthak calculations meaningless, while composing 17 movement symphonies about the philosophical implications of defensive position. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most sophisticated, technologically advanced, and thoroughly pointless military conflict in the history of sentient life. Both civilizations had achieved near godlike mastery over matter, energy, and space itself, yet found themselves locked in a stalemate that would have made medieval siege warfare look dynamic by comparison. Enter humanity, stage left, carrying a toolbox and wearing coveralls that had seen better millennia. Humans had stumbled into galactic civilization roughly 15 years earlier, with all the grace and subtlety of a rhinoceros attempting interpretive, while the Vorthak had spent eons perfecting their crystalline matrices and the Ethereans had transcended physical existence entirely. Humans had mostly just figured out how to make their spacecraft stop exploding quite so often. Their technology resembled what would happen if someone gave a particularly creative child access to duct tape, spare parts from 7 different civilizations, and a complete disregard for manufacturer warranty. The galactic community had initially greeted humanity's arrival with the kind of bemused tolerance typically reserved for distant relatives who show up uninvited to sophisticated dinner parties. Here was a species that had achieved faster-than-light travel by essentially strapping rocket engines to their mistakes and hoping for the best. Their diplomatic corps consisted primarily of individuals whose greatest qualification was an ability to smile while completely misunderstanding everything being said to them. Their military doctrine could be summarized as wing it and see what happens, which was either refreshingly honest or utterly terrifying depending on one's perspective. Both the Vorthak and Ethereans had attempted to recruit humanity as allies, assuming that any species capable of spaceflight must possess some hidden strategic value. The Vorthak had presented humans with detailed mathematical proofs, explaining why joining their empire represented the logically optimal choice. The Ethereans had composed elaborate interpretive light shows demonstrating the aesthetic superiority of their core. Humans, demonstrating their characteristic ability to completely miss the point, had politely declined both offers and requested permission to set up maintenance stations throughout the neutral zone. They wanted to repair things, they explained with the earnest enthusiasm of a species that genuinely enjoyed fixing broken objects for no particular reason other than the satisfaction of making them work again. Both empires had agreed, largely because having someone else handle routine maintenance seemed like a reasonable division of labor. After all, what possible impact could a handful of grease-stained technicians have on a war being fought with weapons that operated on principles of physics so advanced they required their own mathematical language? The answer to that question was currently hunched over a diagnostic panel 3 sectors away from the nearest battle zone, completely oblivious to the fact that the universe was about to become a significantly more interesting place to live. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, someone had to fix that broken ventilation system in Maintenance Bay 7. And unfortunately the only person available for the job was about to demonstrate why the phrase human error had become a legitimate category in galactic insurance policy. The individual destined to accidentally reshape galactic civilization was, at that particular moment, arguing with a ventilation duct that had apparently decided to develop a personality disorder. His name was Eddie Gutierrez, though the universe seemed determined to ensure that nobody particularly important would remember it. He was 34 years old, possessed exactly the kind of unremarkable face that made security guards forget to check his credentials, and had spent the better part of his adult life making broken things work again through a combination of percussive maintenance and creative profanity. Eddie had never intended to become the maintenance supervisor of Waystation Omega, a neutral trading post that floated through space like a cosmic truck stop for beings with too much technology and too little common sense. He had originally signed up to be an engineer aboard a luxury cruise ship, but a clerical error, 2 missed connections, and what the employment agency had euphemistically called a slight miscommunication regarding job placement, had landed him here instead. By the time anyone realized the mistake, Eddie had already fixed 17 critical systems that the previous maintenance crew had declared irreparably damaged, and management had decided that competence trumped paperwork. The waystation itself resembled what would happen if someone had built a shopping mall in zero gravity and then forgotten to include any actual stores. Its corridors twisted through space with the architectural logic of a fever dream, connecting docking bays designed for 17 different species with wildly incompatible ideas about basic concepts like up and structural integrity. The life support systems had been cobbled together from components manufactured by civilizations that had never heard of each other, creating a technical maintenance nightmare that required someone with Eddie's particular brand of improvisational genius. Most days, Eddie found his work genuinely satisfying. There was something deeply therapeutic about taking a piece of alien technology that had been designed by beings with fundamentally different concepts of physics and convincing it to play nicely with equipment built by species that consider different laws of thermodynamics to be more like gentle suggestions. It was puzzle solving on a cosmic scale, and Eddie had always been good with puzzles. Today, however, the ventilation system in Bay 7 had decided to stage what could only be described as a mechanical rebellion. It was supposed to provide atmospheric recycling for the Etherean delegation that had been using the bay as a meditation space, which meant maintaining precisely the right mixture of exotic gases, while ensuring that the ambient energy fields remained stable enough to prevent the Ethereans from accidentally dispersing into component particles. Instead, the system had begun producing what Eddie's diagnostic equipment generously described as atmospheric anomalies, but which more accurately resembled the kind of air quality one might expect to find inside an active volcano having a particularly bad day. Every time Eddie thought he had isolated the problem, another subsystem would develop delusions of grandeur and begin operating according to principles that seemed to violate several fundamental laws of physics. "All right, you piece of crystallized stubbornness," Eddie muttered to the control panel, which had been manufactured by the Vorthak during their geometric minimalism period, and therefore resembled a 3-dimensional headache. "Let's see what you're really upset about." He pulled up the system diagnostics on his handheld scanner, a device that had been designed to interface with 17 different technological standards, and consequently did none of them particularly well. The readout showed a cascade of error messages in 4 different languages, 3 of which used symbols that hurt to look at directly. The obvious solution would have been to call for a specialist, but the nearest Vorthak technician was currently 3 systems away attending a symposium on optimal crystal resonance patterns in combat scenarios, which was apparently a real thing that required 2 weeks of intensive discussion. The Etherean engineering consultant had transcended into pure thought sometime last Tuesday, and wasn't expected back until the philosophical implications of her current project had been properly contemplated, a process that could take anywhere from 6 hours to 6 decades. Eddie sighed and reached for his toolbox, a battered collection of implements that represented humanity's approach to universal compatibility. It contained standard wrenches that had been modified to work with alien bolt patterns, screwdrivers that could interface with 17 different types of fasteners,
and a hammer that Eddie had personally blessed with the ability to convince malfunctioning equipment to reconsider its life choices. The ventilation access panel had been designed by beings who apparently believed that routine maintenance should require advanced degrees in both engineering and interpretive dance. Eddie managed to remove it after only minimal swearing and immediately wished he had. The interior of the system looked like someone had asked a committee of abstract artists to design a mechanical nightmare using components that had been selected by throwing darts at a supply catalog. Well, Eddie said to nobody in particular, this explains a few things. What it explained specifically was why the atmospheric processors were producing gases that existed in a state of quantum uncertainty. The energy flow regulators were operating on principles that predated the discovery of electricity, and the whole system was somehow managing to violate conservation of energy while simultaneously adhering to it with mathematical precision. Eddie had encountered alien technology before, but this was different. This wasn't just advanced engineering built according to unfamiliar principles. This was something that seemed to operate according to rules that changed depending on who was looking at it. The Vorthak components were trying to impose rigid mathematical order on systems that the Etherean elements insisted should flow like liquid music, while the human-manufactured interface units were attempting to translate between the two approaches using diplomatic protocols that nobody had ever actually agreed to. It was, Eddie realized with the kind of dawning horror typically reserved for particularly ominous fortune cookies, a perfect storm of incompatible technologies that had been left alone long enough to develop their own opinions about how physics should work. He reached for what appeared to be a primary coupling, which was glowing with the kind of light that suggested it contained either enormous amounts of energy or a very small but extremely angry star. According to his scanner, touching it would either recalibrate the entire system or possibly open a small tear in space-time. The margin of error on that prediction was roughly 50. Eddie considered calling for backup, requesting additional equipment, or possibly just posting a do not disturb sign and hoping the problem would solve itself. These were all reasonable, sensible options that any rational person would have chosen. Instead, he adjusted his grip on his scanner, checked to make sure his insurance premiums were up to date, and reached for the coupling with the kind of determined optimism that had carried humanity from the caves to the stars. How hard could it be? He asked the universe. The universe, as it turned out, had been waiting for exactly that question.
What happened next would later be described in 17 different academic papers, 3 doctoral dissertations, and 1 particularly frantic insurance claim, as an unprecedented cascade of technological incompatibilities, resulting in systematic dysfunction across multiple galactic sectors. Eddie would have described it more succinctly as, well, that wasn't supposed to happen. The moment his fingers made contact with the coupling, every system on Waystation Omega experienced what could charitably be called an existential crisis. The Vorthak components, suddenly exposed to human bioelectric fields that operated on completely different principles than their crystalline matrices had been designed to accommodate, began recalculating their operational parameters. Unfortunately, they did this by broadcasting their confusion across every communication frequency simultaneously, which meant that every Vorthak vessel within a 3-system radius suddenly received detailed technical specifications for a ventilation system, having what appeared to be a nervous breakdown. The Etherean elements, meanwhile, interpreted the sudden influx of chaotic energy patterns as some sort of cosmic revelation and began harmonizing with Eddie's neural activity. Since Eddie was primarily thinking about lunch and wondering whether he should have read the safety manual more carefully, the entire Etherean meditation network suddenly found itself contemplating the philosophical implications of ham sandwiches and occupational liability. The immediate result was that atmospheric control throughout the Waystation began operating according to principles that seemed to change every few seconds. Bay 7 filled with a gas that smelled faintly of vanilla and existed in 7 dimensions simultaneous. The main corridor developed breathable air that somehow managed to be both perfectly oxygenated and completely invisible, leading to a series of minor panic attacks among visiting dignitaries who were convinced they had stopped breathing entirely. Eddie, blissfully unaware that he had just caused the first documented case of cross-species technological empathy, was mostly concerned with the fact that his scanner was now displaying readings in colors that didn't technically exist. The coupling he had touched was pulsing with energy patterns that formed geometric shapes in the air, which would have been fascinating if they hadn't also been somehow broadcasting themselves directly into his brain. Okay, he said, addressing the rapidly expanding light show that had replaced the ventilation system. "This is definitely not covered in the manual." 3 systems away, the Vorthak Strategic Command experienced what their analysts would later describe as computational overflow resulting from exposure to non-standardized input parameters. Every battle computer in the fleet suddenly found itself trying to calculate tactical solutions for scenarios involving unpredictable atmospheric conditions, ham sandwiches, and the philosophical implications of maintenance schedule. The mathematical complexity was so far beyond their programming that several systems simply shut down, rather than admit they couldn't solve problems involving lunch meat and existential uncertainty. Admiral Jekterth, whose crystalline form had been perfectly calibrated for strategic thinking across multiple dimensional frameworks, found himself staring at tactical displays that showed human lunch preferences overlaid with hyperspace navigation charts. His fleet's positioning algorithms were attempting to optimize for something called pickle distribution efficiency, while maintaining defensive formations against what the computers had labeled sandwich-based temporal anomaly. "What?" he asked his bridge crew in harmonics that roughly translated to, "I require immediate explanation before my sanity crystallizes into geometric fragments," is happening to our tactical systems. Meanwhile, on the other side of the conflict, the Etherean Coalition was experiencing its own version of technological enlightenment. The sudden injection of Eddie's pragmatic fix-it-yourself approach to problem-solving was propagating through their consciousness network like a virus of practical competence. Beings who had spent centuries contemplating the aesthetic perfection of their battle formations were suddenly seized with an overwhelming urge to actually accomplish something concrete. Fleet Coordinator Luminescence of Dawn, reflecting through probability crystal, whose name took roughly 6 minutes to pronounce in its entirety, found her normally serene mental state invaded by thoughts about preventive maintenance schedules and whether anyone had checked the expiration dates on their emergency rations lately. Her elegant fleet formations were spontaneously reorganizing themselves according to what her tactical consciousness was describing as common-sense efficiency protocols. Back on Way Station Omega, Eddie was discovering that touching alien technology while having no idea what it was supposed to do could lead to increasingly entertaining consequences. The ventilation system had apparently decided that its primary function was now to serve as a communication relay between incompatible civilizations, which meant that every maintenance request, system diagnostic, and random technical observation was being broadcast across both fleets simultaneously. The Vorthak were receiving detailed reports about the way station's coffee machine maintenance requirements translated into mathematical proofs about optimal caffeine distribution algorithms. The Ethereans were experiencing profound spiritual revelations about the cosmic significance of regularly scheduled filter replacements and the philosophical implications of decaffeinated beverages in zero-gravity environments. Both fleets began experiencing what military historians would later term tactical confusion of unprecedented magnitude. The Vorthak battle computers, unable to process scenarios involving lunch preferences and plumbing repair schedules, began defaulting to increasingly conservative strategy. If they couldn't calculate optimal attack patterns when faced with variables like sandwich selection methodology and appropriate wrench torque specifications, they reasoned perhaps the safest approach would be to avoid engaging in combat entirely until someone could explain what these new factors meant. The Ethereans, meanwhile, were discovering that Eddie's straightforward approach to problem-solving was remarkably effective when applied to military logistics. Fleet movements that had previously required weeks of aesthetic contemplation and philosophical debate were suddenly being executed with ruthless efficiency. Why spend months debating the symbolic meaning of starboard formations when you could simply position your ships where they would be most useful and get on with whatever needed to be accomplished? Eddie, still completely oblivious to the fact that his routine maintenance call was reshaping interstellar warfare, was primarily focused on the increasingly urgent problem of the ventilation system, which had now expanded beyond its original housing and was creating what appeared to be a small but very persistent artificial aurora in the middle of the maintenance bay. "This," he said, reaching for his hammer with the kind of determination that had made human engineering famous throughout 17 sectors, "is definitely going in my incident report." The coupling pulsed brighter, and somewhere in the depths of space, 2 massive fleets began experiencing the most profoundly confusing military engagement in recorded history. Not because they were fighting each other, but because they were both trying to fight the same inexplicable enemy,
the chaotic unpredictability of human problem-solving methodology that was now propagating through their tactical networks like a benevolent plague of competent practicality. Neither side had any idea what was happening to them, but they were both becoming increasingly convinced that whatever it was probably the other fleet's fault. Eddie stared at his hammer for a long moment, weighing his options with the kind of careful consideration that had made him legendary among maintenance crews throughout 3 sectors. On one hand, hitting sophisticated alien technology with percussive maintenance tools was generally discouraged by both manufacturer warranties and basic survival instincts. On the other hand, the ventilation system was now generating what appeared to be a small but persistent weather pattern that was raining upward and occasionally producing tiny lightning bolts that spelled out mathematical equations in languages that predated the invention of vowels. Sometimes, he said to the Aurora that was now performing interpretive dance moves in the corner, you just have to trust the hammer. What Eddie couldn't have known was that at that precise moment, both alien fleets had reached the same conclusion through entirely different chains of logic. The Vorthak, after 17 hours of computational analysis involving lunch meat variables and maintenance scheduling algorithms, had determined that the only rational response to incomprehensible tactical conditions was to implement what their databases had labeled Strategic Option Omega, collaborative problem resolution. The Ethereans, meanwhile, had experienced a collective spiritual awakening about the cosmic significance of actually finishing projects, instead of contemplating them indefinitely, and had decided to attempt something they called practical harmony through unified action. Neither fleet knew that the other had reached identical conclusions. Neither fleet understood that their decisions were being influenced by the philosophical musings of a maintenance worker who just wanted to fix a broken fan. And absolutely nobody was prepared for what happened when Eddie applied percussive maintenance to a coupling that was currently serving as an interdimensional communication relay between 2 civilizations who had been trying to kill each other for over 4 centuries. The hammer connected with the coupling at precisely the moment that both fleets initiated their respective peace overtures. The result was what would later be described in academic circles as a spontaneous convergence of incompatible technologies, resulting in the first documented case of accidental diplomatic resolution through mechanical intervention. What actually happened was considerably more dramatic. The coupling, which had been struggling to translate between Vorthak mathematical precision and Etherean aesthetic philosophy while simultaneously processing Eddie's stream of consciousness approach to problem solving, suddenly found itself tasked with facilitating communication between 2 fleets who had just decided to attempt peaceful contact. The system responded to this challenge by doing what any reasonable piece of technology would do when faced with an impossible task. It improvised wildly and hoped for the best. Every communication system in both fleets simultaneously received what their translation protocols interpreted as detailed technical specifications for ending the war. The Vorthak received precise mathematical proofs, demonstrating that continued conflict was statistically inefficient when factored against variables involving maintenance costs, lunch scheduling, and the philosophical implications of actually accomplishing something productive. The Ethereans experienced profound artistic visions showing the aesthetic beauty of cooperative engineering projects, and the spiritual fulfillment that came from making broken things work properly. Both fleets found these arguments surprisingly compelling. Admiral Zhektoth stared at his tactical displays, which were now showing complex equations, proving that peace was mathematically superior to war when all relevant factors were properly calculated, including the previously unknown variables of job satisfaction and reasonable lunch break duration. The logic was unassailable, even if it was being presented alongside detailed schematics for what appeared to be a ventilation repair procedure. Signal the Etherean fleet, he ordered in harmonics, that roughly translated to, I am experiencing computational clarity of unprecedented magnitude. Request immediate diplomatic conference to discuss collaborative implementation of these newly discovered efficiency protocol. Luminescence of Dawn, reflecting through probability crystals, was experiencing her own moment of revelation as her consciousness network processed visions of 2 fleets working together to solve practical problems instead of creating them. The aesthetic beauty of cooperative engineering was so overwhelming that several members of her collective had spontaneously composed symphonies about proper tool maintenance and the cosmic significance of reading instruction manuals. Acknowledge the Vorthak communication, she instructed her fleet in harmonics that sparkled with newfound purpose. Propose immediate establishment of joint technical committees to explore these remarkable collaborative efficiency methodologies. Meanwhile, Eddie was discovering that his hammer had apparently fixed everything and broken everything simultaneously. The ventilation system was now working perfectly, producing exactly the right atmospheric conditions for 17 different species, while maintaining optimal energy efficiency and occasionally humming what sounded like a cheerful little tune. Unfortunately, it was also broadcasting his thoughts directly to both alien fleets, which meant that his idle wondering about whether he should have packed a bigger lunch was being analyzed by military strategists as a profound commentary on resource allocation methodology. The peace negotiations that followed were unlike anything in galactic history. Both sides arrived at the conference table convinced that they had discovered revolutionary new approaches to interstellar relations through the application of what the Vorthak termed human practical philosophy, and the Ethereans called the sacred art of actually getting things done. They spent 6 days hammering out a comprehensive peace treaty that included detailed provisions for joint engineering projects, collaborative maintenance protocols, and the establishment of regular lunch break schedules for all military personnel. Eddie, who had been invited to the negotiations as the apparent architect of this new diplomatic philosophy, spent most of the conference trying to explain that he had just been attempting to fix a broken fan and wasn't really qualified to revolutionize interstellar relations. Both sides interpreted his modesty as profound wisdom and incorporated it into the final treaty as a fundamental principle of peaceful coexistence. The war officially ended on a Tuesday, concluded not by superior firepower or strategic brilliance, but by the universal recognition that cooperative maintenance was more satisfying than competitive destruction. Both fleets immediately began joint projects to repair the damages they had inflicted on each other over the previous 4 centuries, discovering in the process that working together to fix things was considerably more enjoyable than working separately to break them. 6 months later, Eddie was still trying to explain to the media that he hadn't intended to end the Great Galactic War. He had just been doing his job. The interview requests, academic symposiums and diplomatic honors were flattering, but mostly they just got in the way of his real work, which was keeping Waystation Omega's increasingly sophisticated systems running smoothly. The ventilation system in Bay 7 had become something of a pilgrimage site, visited by beings from across the galaxy who wanted to experience the place where peace had accidentally broken out. Eddie had installed a small plaque next to the access panel that read, "Please do not touch the equipment unless you know what you're doing," but visitors generally interpreted this as a profound philosophical statement about the nature of unintended consequence. On quiet nights, when the way station was peaceful and his rounds were complete, Eddie would sometimes stop by Bay 7 and listen to the ventilation system humming its cheerful little tune. The sound reminded him of the most important lesson he had learned from his brief career as an accidental galactic peacemaker. Sometimes the best way to solve impossible problems was to ignore their impossibility and focus on fixing whatever was actually broken. The universe, as it turned out, had quite a sense of humor about these things. It had taken 2 of the most sophisticated civilizations in galactic history, exactly 437 years, 2 months, and 16 days to discover what any maintenance worker could have told them from the beginning. Most problems were a lot less complicated than they appeared, and usually they just needed someone willing to roll up their sleeves and actually fix them. Eddie picked up his toolbox and headed home, completely unaware that 3 sectors away, a joint Vorthak Etherean engineering team was already planning their next collaborative project, a comprehensive maintenance upgrade for the entire galactic communication network, based on principles they had learned from studying his repair log. After all, if it worked once, how hard could it be to do it again?